Hi, so in this video we're gonna go over macros. So we're gonna talk about what macros are and also go over pros and cons and basically how you can use them and the differences between them and functions. So macros are basically like collapsed nodes that are reusable. You can basically use them multiple times, but in essence they are just nodes that are collapsed into one singular node, and you can basically just call it multiple times. They're only called in event graphs, so you cannot call them in functions because of some of the details that we're going to talk about, mainly delays and stuff like that. So let's start. First pro for macros is that they support async actions and also delays. So if I do something like a delay and I try to collapse this into a function, it's gonna give me an error. But if I try to collapse this into a macro, let's name it delay, we can see that we can do this. And also if I click on the delay, we can also add input and output executions, and basically we can use this to trigger our delay or whatever functionality we want inside. One special thing about macros is that they have execution pins that you can create, and you can basically have multiple of them for inputs and outputs. This is a special thing that you cannot have for functions. So function has only one input and one output pin. And you can also do everything else in here. So you can have any data type. There is some nodes that you cannot have. So if we try to type timeline, we can see that it is not acceptable. So you cannot have every type of delayed action, but you can have a lot of functionality that you cannot have in functions. Another thing for macros is similar thing to function is that they are reusable. That basically means that I can call this delay wherever I want in any event graph, and we basically duplicate code. So this is kind of a main thing with macros, similar to functions. Basically you can just duplicate it instead of having to copy the code inside multiple times. And the third pro is visual clarity. So when you start working with nodes that usually have delays or multiple inputs and outputs, and you cannot put it in a function, to make your code cleaner and more visually simple, what you're gonna do is start using macros, and you can also start using the collapse node. So if I right click, I have this option to collapse the node, and this basically means that these nodes are gonna be pasted later at compile time. They're gonna be pasted in the graph, but you can just collapse them for visual clarity, and of course rename your graph and stuff like that. But you're not gonna go over that right now. But just keep in mind, this is a really good thing for visual clarity and clean up your blueprints. So the fourth pro is multiple execution pins. So if I click plus on a macro and let's name it execution, and what I'm gonna do is click plus in here and I'm gonna set this to execution. Let's name it execution 1 and let's name it out 1. So basically what we can do is click plus in here, execution 2, and you can also do output. And this way you can have macro that has multiple input and execution pins. So this can be really useful if you have maybe a complicated branch node and you basically need maybe true and false outputs, but you of course cannot do that in a function. In function, what you can do is basically have a boolean output, and then you can do a branch there and do stuff like that. But in the execution pin, you can basically have maybe multiple inputs and multiple outputs. So one thing, if we look at timeline, this is kind of a macro that Epic uses, where it has multiple input pins and a few output pins, and this way you can customize it way more and do a lot of fun stuff without having the complexity of having the whole code be in the event graph. So it can be all collapsed into one simple macro. Fifth pro is macro library. So if we go in here, I'm gonna click right click and go to blueprints. We can see that we have the blueprint macro library. So if I click on that, first thing that we need to choose is basically the class. So one thing about macro libraries is that they are tied to a class. So the function libraries are just tied to blueprints, but macro libraries are tied to specific classes. So if I select a pawn, and let's name it something like that, and open it up, in here what we can do is get player pawn, and we can have some other pawn functions. That is kind of a good thing about macros, that you can kind of target a specific class that you want, but you cannot have it for everything. The best way to kind of have it maybe more globally is to use an actor as a base class, and since a lot of things derive from an actor, you're gonna have this macro available wherever you want. But let's say we want this to be test macro, and I'm just gonna give it a thing here. I'm gonna save. If now I go and create a blueprint class and click on the pawn, let's go to event graph, and we can type test macro and we can have our macro in here. Now if we create an actor, open it up, try to type test macro, we're not gonna have it. So that is one downside. Now another good thing is that if you go to a derived class, so if I create a character and open it up, type test macro, we can see that we still have access to this macro. So whatever blueprint class derives from pawn, they're also gonna have access to the macro. The last pro for macros is that they are inlined, and this basically means that they do not have a little call overhead that the functions have, because functions are called in a different place. You kind of have to have a little bit of overhead for that call, but macros are basically pasted in the location where they are. That's why they have to be in the event graph. That is kind of a small thing, that there is a little bit of overhead when you're calling functions, but not with macros. But macros are copy-pasted, so there can be duplicate code and stuff like that. That's kind of a little pro that you probably won't notice while you work, but just good to keep in mind. Okay, now let's go to cons. So the first con is that there is no local variables in macros. So if I go into my execution pin, you can see that we have no way to basically add any local variables. So that means that you only have access to your global variables. And this means that you can't have like temporary variables that you can just fire, forget, change inside of this macro and kind of reset it when you call the macro the next time. The only thing that you can do is basically use these variables that are attached to your class. The second con is the code is duplicated. So there is a little bit of memory overhead, but this is also not something that you should worry about much. But there is a little bit of memory overhead just because you have macros duplicated when they are basically compiled, unlike functions that have their own space where they're called from. The third con is that there is no breakpoints. So if I go into my function, let's say set mouse position. Let's say we want to do something like this. And let's say I wanted to debug this. So if I click right click, we can see that we don't have an option to add breakpoints. So this is even more limited debugging than what we had with functions or other nodes in the blueprint. So that is also one thing to keep in mind. It might be a bit harder to debug. You of course still can do print string, stuff like that, but you can do breakpoints, which can be pretty useful in some cases. And the fourth con is no access modifiers. The encapsulation that happens with macros is that they are basically mostly visual, and you don't have any access modifiers where you can say that classes that have a reference to this class can or cannot access some of the macros, so they're always going to have access to it. So you can have some that type of encapsulation. So it's basically a visual encapsulation. So as an example, some of the uses that you can use macros for. One way that you can use it is, let's say you have an enum. So I created an example enum here. I'm gonna click get variable, and then I'm gonna do switch. And let's say we have only one input, and we basically want to select output based on a switch. So what we can do in here is have as many output as we want, or as enums are in here, and then we can do something like this. So if maybe we have some logic in here, and this is maybe a bit more complicated than this, what you can do is encapsulate it all in here. Maybe you can add another one. And now, instead of having all that logic in here, you can have a simple macro and outputs for each enum entry, basically. Next example of how you can use macros is to collapse some conditional logic. So if I type a branch, let's say we are checking this variable. We're gonna use equal enum. So if it's, let's say, a capsule, we connect it in here, then maybe we want to set this to, let's say, to be a box, and if it's not, we set it to be a capsule. So this can be easily collapsed, so I can do a right click, collapse to macro, let's name it check capsule, and now what we can do is add 3 execution pins, and we can say something like this. And now we have the 2 outputs, and if you look back, we can see it looks way more simple, way more clean. and inside we can have all of the logic for the branch. So this is it for the introduction to macros. Let me know what you think, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments.